Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod and the second semi-final in the Battle of the Marshals. It may have taken us 18 months to try and resolve this titanic clash, but resolve it we will. Tonight, we return with that dastardly question of who is Napoleon's greatest marshal. Cue Josh complaining at me about how I haven't set the parameters about this, but hey, why preempt a whole 5 minutes of Josh ranting? Josh is trying to make out that he's some kind of gangster. I presume from sort of downtown LA or something. I don't know. But he's broken out the sunglasses and is sort of nodding at me in a way that suggests that he thinks that he's not exactly from the hood, but I don't know quite what vibe Josh has got. Josh, what vibe are you going for? This is ridiculous. What are you doing?
I'm just going for a generally. You said that working with YouTubers was like working with a diva, so I was going diva. But if you're getting mob vibes, I'll go with it. We'll find a way. We'll find a way to enhance the gangster in the right direction. It doesn't have. I'm international. I'm an international criminal.
GTA Napoleonic Edition, this is not. And my other judge, Catherine Bayford, returns. Catherine, how are you doing?
I'm very well. All the better for being here. Thanks, Zach.
Oh, that's very kind of you for saying so. You haven't been put off by Josh's sort of ludicrous sunglasses shenanigans.
If anything, I'm lured in by it, and I really think that that's due to my instinctive love for the theatrical, which I have to say is giving me a slight bias towards one of the marshals in this round, but I won't say who just yet.
Yeah, no, we established this last time, folks. If you haven't heard about Catherine's favorite marshal, then well, you need to go back and listen to the first semi-final. But all I will say is that if you've got an ostrich feather in your back pocket, you stand a good chance. All right, then. So a reminder of how these semi-finals work. Each semi-final is a balloon debate. So what is a balloon debate, I hear you cry? Well, the idea is that you have our six marshals in the basket, and then the hot air balloon loses power. You jettison the ballast, but it's not enough. You need to jettison people. But which people, which ballast do you jettison? That's where the balloon debate comes in. So we will have 3 rounds. At the end of each round, one contender will be thrown out of the basket, and that will leave 3 standing to make it through to a public vote, where you folks will make the decision on which one goes through to the grand final. Each of those 3 rounds will refocus respectively on, in the first round, each contender's greatest moment. In round 2, each contender's more general military record. And in round 3, the legacy of said contender. My champions will have 2.5 minutes to make the case for why their marshal should survive. But anyone taking more than 2.5 minutes will be cut off by that inimitable line from the Napoleon movie. You think you are so great because you have boats.
You think you're so great because you have boats!
We will hear those pitches back to back, after which there will then be around 5 minutes. I say it's 5 minutes. It won't be 5 minutes. It will be as long as I feel the discussion is good for, where people will get to stab each other in the back, which is what we're really here for. We're here for the vicious backstabbing that frankly would have happened in a real life version of this. To be honest, I'm not sure anybody would have made it out of that hot air balloon alive anyway, even if it hadn't lost power. So we will then put all of this to the judges, and we will then decide on who gets eliminated. But the eliminated champions will then get to stay in the call, and the ghost of the eliminated marshal will be able to contribute to the discussion. Let us now introduce our contributors this evening and the people they will be representing. So Michel Ney has made it through and is represented by Todd Campbell, a friend of the show and the renewable energy future czar from the US. Welcome, Todd.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
We also have Davout in the chat. Well, not like literally in the chat this evening, but Davout has made it through. I mean, big surprise. I think Davout literally romped home in that by the clearest margin. possible. And Davout is championed by Rachel Stark, the much loved marshal, much loved. I've tried to say this about 4 times and can't get it out. The much loved master of martial mayhem and business lecturer. Rachel, welcome back. It has been far too long, although that's entirely because I didn't wrap up this series and I didn't want to influence people's voting by dropping more martial stuff on them. How are you? Hello.
Good, thank you. Thank you for having me back again.
You will be back for much, much more on the Marshals. That is a promise. The Marshall series will make a very welcome return in the not too distant future. So, folks, you can look forward to that. But back to the business of tonight. Saint-Cyr also made it through. I'm getting kind of surprised faces from some folks in the chat, not least from the person who's championing Saint-Cyr, which doesn't fill me with a huge amount of confidence, if I'm being honest. Noah Fink. Noah, last time you got plaudits for facial hair. I shall just at this moment pause before properly introducing you and check. So, Catherine, last time Sam Jolly gave Noah points on the basis of his moustache. Now, what I need to ascertain is whether or not facial hair is something that will sway your judging capacity this evening.
One of my problems right now is that whilst the audience can't see, it appears to me that Noah may be wearing a turtleneck. And so I'm getting a lovely sort of gradient effect, I have to say, going up the face. Which I just think in terms of aesthetics is quite interesting.
I noticed the term there was interesting as opposed to anything else. I won't try.
It was complimentary. It was a complimentary interesting.
Yeah, you've dug yourself out of that hole, Catherine. Nicely done. So for folks who perhaps won't know, Noah, well, he describes himself as an international man of mystery, which, you know, we could just kind of conclude his bio there, but he is an HR professional at an US university that will remain nameless. Noah, welcome. Nice to see you. Yes. Congratulations on your facial hair, I think is what I meant to say.
Perhaps. But it's lovely to be back. Again, perhaps a little surprised as Saint-Cyr stumbling through the snows of Russia. I've stumbled into this round, and we'll see at what point I have to stumble out. But very happy to be here.
It's great to have you. We also have Murat, who made it through. Do you know what? I don't have a problem with that. Genuinely, because like Murat needed to be in the semi-final. Like if he didn't, then he'd have probably just jumped on a horse and charged in regardless. But yeah, I mean, Murat was in round 4, was facing off with Bernadotte and Suchet, and actually came joint second in that round. So really creditable performance from Murat there. Murat is championed by John Viscardo, a very familiar voice that you will know from the Generals and Napoleon podcast. And John is also the CEO of Viscardo Enterprises. John, welcome, fellow podcaster. I noticed that you are much less of a diva to deal with than young Master Proven here, which, believe me, is much appreciated.
I am a YouTuber as well. I'm not as accomplished as Master Provan, but yes, I would like to say I'm happy to be here, championing the cause of Marshal Murat, and I cannot wait to get started.
That sounds like a podcast is kind of very gently coded. Can you get on with this already? Because we're, 10 minutes into the recording, and we haven't actually talked about any of the marshals properly yet. Duly noted. Thank you for doing a better job of managing this show than I do. Like, thumbs up and plaudits. Marmont also made it through. Now, there's a controversial one. The Ragusa has made it through, which pleases me mightily. Because it's known that I have a soft spot for Marmont. Was he the greatest marshal? Well, but we'll get to that later. And Marmont is championed by Dave Watson. Now, Dave is a think tank director and is the author of The Napoleonic Wars in the Adriatic, the Frontiers Sea. Dave, firstly, apologies that we haven't sat you down for an interview on that, because really interesting topic. We need to make that happen. But also, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Welcome from the Balkans, surprise, surprise, where I usually am when trekking around battlefields. And of course, Marmont was the Balkan Marshal. Napoleon only got as far as Venice. He couldn't face the rigors of the Balkans. I'm pleased to do Marmont. I'm somewhat surprised to be here, given he's hated by Bonapartists and Royalists. So it doesn't leave many other than me, but we'll do our best.
Absolutely. I am looking forward to that. And then last to make it through is Suchet, except that there's a problem. Our champion for Suchet was, at least in the first round, Anthony Gumbau, who, due to, I don't quite know how this administration slash clerical error happened, but basically he's not able to be here this evening. Now, when I threatened my very generous contributors, who of course are giving up their time for free, and corralled them and threatened to sort of eliminate them, my threat was, if you don't turn up, your marshal gets eliminated. Now we could do that, but then I had a smart idea. Well, I'm calling it a smart idea, but it's not that smart, because my smart idea is to do what all of my students do when they have an essay due, like the night before, and they haven't written the essay or done any of the research. Basically, what I've decided to do is test Chat GPT. So I have asked. So there were three options. I could have got somebody else to champion Suchet. I could have done him myself, or we could test whether Chat GPT is really coming for us historians' jobs. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So I have asked Chat GPT for some commentary on Suchet. I've had to prod Chat GPT quite hard in some respects, because the quality was, well, I'll let you judge for the quality for yourself. But Suchet is championed by Chat GPT, who isn't able to come amongst us and welcome themselves and say hello. But on behalf of Chat GPT, no, I'm not about to say hi on behalf of Chat GPT. That's there are limits to how low this podcast will stoop, and we have finally hit rock bottom. So, folks, welcome. Thank you to all of our guests for giving up their time this evening. And we are going to dive into round one, he says, 15 minutes into the recording. Now, this is each contender's greatest moment. Reminder, folks, you have 2.5 minutes to make your case. And I'm going to start with Todd.
All right. Hi, I'm Todd Campbell. I'm representing Michel Ney. They say fortune favors the bold, and that statement perfectly frames Michel Ney, greatest marshal of the First Empire. As a person, Ney was a great husband. He wasn't a plunderer on a campaign. He had ethics in his decisions. In terms of unmatched bravery, there's no doubt Ney wins here. Ney was always at the front, saber in hand, charging with his men. During battles like Friedland, Eylau, and Borodino, his fearless leadership often turned the tide. At Waterloo, 5 horses were shot out from under him. Think about that. What would you do? Run away, probably, most likely, but not Ney. Ney was loyal to Napoleon to the end. Even after pledging allegiance to the restored Bourbon monarchy, he famously rejoined Napoleon during the 100 Days, a decision that ultimately led to his execution. Ney also played a key role in major campaigns. He was indispensable in Napoleon's key victories, Elchingen, Jena, Friedland, Smolensk. His rear guard from Russia was legendary, so much so that Napoleon called him the bravest of the brave. Ney was charismatic. Soldiers loved Ney. He had the charisma of a warrior hero and was respected by the troops more than any other marshal. And in sum, Ney's combination of valor, presence, and unshakable loyalty made him the embodiment of the Napoleonic warrior spirit and the greatest marshal of the period. You cannot have the Napoleonic Wars without Ney, an enduring and legendary figure of the period. In terms of his greatest moment, picture this. You're retreating from Moscow. You're in the rear guard. You have, 3,000 men. You're pushing back on the Russians. Ultimately, you have to break, and you're left with 2,000 men. You go down to 600 men. I think his role not only was legendary, it probably saved the empire more than we probably understand. Without him being there, to push back, I think the empire would have collapsed. And he, even though I think the Grand Army certainly suffered some major credibility after that campaign, I think he restored some. And I think that France was able to fight for a couple more years because of it. The fact that he was named Bravest Brave, he earned that. You could say that he blundered, he was brash at times, but I would have to argue you have to be talented to be able to hold up the Russians and the Cossacks under those circumstances.
All right, thank you, Todd. We go rapid fire on these. Next up, Rachel on behalf of Davout.
Okay, so I would suggest that Marshal Davout's finest moment is undoubtedly the Battle of Auerstedt on October 14th, 1806. In advance of the battle, Davout was tasked with marching to the extreme right of Napoleon's main force when he came unexpectedly face to face with the bulk of the Prussian army, who Napoleon had been expecting to face at Jena. Was Bernadotte supposed to be with him? That's a whole other debate, which we don't have time for, but ultimately Davout was on his own with about 26,000 to 27,000 men. He faced a force of 60 to 65,000. Not quite odd to 3-1, but damn near enough. Those numbers are astounding, I would say, pretty much on their own. I don't think any of the other marshals achieved a victory quite on this scale, quite to this standard. But I've seen some people say, oh, we make too much of Auerstedt. It was a bit of a fluke. It was lucky. So I'm going to look beyond the quantifiables. Here's why I think it shows Davout very much at his best. The Third Corps was famous for being in astoundingly good discipline. Davout wasn't called the Iron Marshal for no good reason. They were standing absolutely atrocious pounding at Auerstedt. Blucher attacks them aggressively, they hold. The Prince of Orange attacks them aggressively, they hold again. They hold over and over and over all day. Eventually they advance, they're pounded by the Prussian artillery, and they keep going. Davout defends the situation with real tactical brilliance and goes on the counteroffensive at exactly the right moment. It turns into a full-scale retreat. There's about 13,000 to 15,000 Prussian casualties, 3,000 prisoners. They lose the Duke of Brunswick. And I think the fortitude of the Third Corps to withstand what they did on that day, Gudin loses 40% of his divisional strength alone on that day, is 100% down to the style of Davout's command. He instills this incredible sense of discipline, of fortitude, and confidence in his leadership. This isn't a charismatic, grandiose, dramatic man, but he is a man who knows how to lead with discipline. He's amongst his men, he encourages them, he drives them on. And crucially, this isn't Napoleon's victory. This isn't under Napoleon's oversight. This is an individual triumph for Davout, demonstrating his tactical brilliance. It's decisive, it's strategically impactful, and it's crucial to the triumph of 1806. There's a lot of great victories in the Napoleonic Wars, but do any of the other marshals have an individual strategic victory quite like this one? C'est fini.
And done in under the time limit. Nicely done there, Rachel. Thank you for that. Applause around the room. Next up, Saint-Cyr. Noah, the floor is yours.
Thank you kindly. So for Saint-Cyr, I propose that his greatest moment came in the defense of Dresden in 1813. It's an event in which he showed extreme competence in all phases of warfare, both initially independently and then secondly under Napoleon's direct eye. This event was to confirm Napoleon's view that Saint-Cyr was the best among us in the line of defense. On the greater strategic level for the German campaign, Saint-Cyr correctly predicted the Allied movements and the strength that would come through the Dresden corridor, where Napoleon presumed it would come primarily through Silesia. He also understood the strength of that force through the area, again, which Napoleon thought he was exaggerating. Later on, after the Battle of Dresden, he also had a clear grasp that for the run-up to Leipzig, it would have been imperative to concentrate all forces and to make the decision to abandon Dresden and abandon the capital of an ally, as difficult as that would be, to concentrate all force against the enemy army and its, therefore, destruction. Napoleon, unfortunately, faithfully countermanded this. On the more operational level, when Saint-Cyr found himself facing a force around 10 times more numerous than his, he communicated the intelligence he was able to gather effectively to Napoleon at headquarters and was able to conduct a fighting withdrawal up the roads and to the suburbs of Dresden over several days, and also managed to do so without being caught in a general engagement and therefore being destroyed in toto. On the tactical elements, Saint-Cyr displayed his aptitude for the offensive as well as the defensive that Napoleon would credit him for. During his withdrawal to the suburbs, he conducted a forceful counterattack. As he was withdrawing up the roads, he then threw the Allies into confusion regarding the strength of his force and what exactly was in front of them, therefore delaying their advance on Dresden and buying some much-needed time for Imperial forces. On both days of the battle, he led local counterattacks and offensives in the center. He helped to gain artillery platforms in the suburbs and protect Ney's flanks from an attack, stymieing Allied attempts to wrest momentum in the battle. Defensively, he withdrew his force in the face of severe numerical inferiority without losing command and control. He used successfully makeshift fortifications and constructed 5 redoubts, and thus he was able to perform successfully in all facets befitting a marshal within the span of a few days and brought some hope for Napoleon's German campaign.
That is the most emphatic demonstration of how you use 2.5 minutes I have ever seen. That was right on the cusp there. Next up is Murat. John, it's all yours.
Let's talk about the best dressed marshal. We can talk about all the other things, the hair, the panache, the style of the uniforms. But if we're talking about best dressed marshal, it has to go to Murat. However, we're talking about the best, greatest moment of Marshal Murat, and this occurred in February 1807. At the Battle of Eylau, Murat's cavalry charge of 11,000 troopers stymied the great Russian advance of Bennigsen, broke through 2, possibly 3 Russian lines, then turned around and did it again. Who did Napoleon turn to when the odds were stacked against him at Eylau? I mean, we were talking about limited visibility, a snowstorm. Augereau's corps has been destroyed. Soult is up against the wall, hanging on by a thread. Even the great Marshal Davout can't make headway. Who does he turn to? Marshal Murat. Leading the charge in person with a riding crop in his hand, not a sword, not a lance, a riding crop or a cane in some stories, leads 11,000 troopers. Doesn't like walk them up to the line and say good luck. Leads them through the Russian lines and then leads them back and saves the Battle of Eylau from becoming a rout of Napoleon to a bloody stalemate. If I had to do a second greatest moment, it'd probably be helping Napoleon's 18 Brumaire coup, but we're talking about greatest moment, and it has to be the Battle of Eylau for Marshal Murat. Thank you.
Short and sweet. Thank you for that, John. Next up, we finally now get to Marmont. And Dave, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Zach. I'm Dave Watson, better known as Balkan Dave. So unsurprisingly, I'm batting for Auguste de Marmont. Now, when it comes to Marmont's greatest moment, of course, there were many. My first thought was helping to end the war in 1814, when it was evident to everyone, except Napoleon, of course, that the game was up. It was Marmont who had the balls to tell Napoleon that he'd started negotiations. However, instead, I've gone for something a little different. I've gone for his appointment as the military and civil governor of Dalmatia and Duke of Ragusa, which, for those who don't know, is modern-day Dubrovnik, a little wider than that, but basically that's the area. I've chosen this because this is what separates Marmont from the pack of the other marshals. He was the fully rounded marshal. Now, most of the marshals could perform reasonably well militarily, although usually under the supervision of Napoleon. But Marmont had an independent command, not just in Dalmatia, but elsewhere as well. Of course, he still had the flurry of the emperor's letters arriving on a regular basis, but he was a fair distance away, so he could ignore them better than most. and he managed to govern one of the most difficult territories in the empire. Now, most marshals wouldn't know where to start to do that, and when they tried, they often ruled with a heavy hand, creating disturbances and insurrection. So for 5 years, Marmont was Dalmatia's military and civil governor, and traces of his rule survive both in public works, you can see them to this day in Dalmatia, and in the memory of the people, not the current people, but certainly in terms of the historiography of the region. He introduced the rule of law and prison reform. He abolished torture and flogging, created schools and colleges, learned Croatian, and had some grasp of 6 other languages spoken in the province. Most South Slav historians agreed he ruled well, and streets were named after him until World War II. He was liked despite having to finance the costs of French administration and fund war reparations. All of these demonstrated the combination of military, diplomatic, and administrative skills that made him the premier Marshal of France.
Thank you for that, Dave. And now entering the sort of chat podcast microphone, Chat GPT, making the case for this. This feels so weird. Can I just pause for a second and reflect on this? That artificial intelligence is now trying to argue the case for Marshal Suchet being Napoleon's greatest marshal. So the way that I did this is that I put a couple of questions. What was Marshal Suchet's greatest moment? And then I wasn't satisfied. So I said, can you give me a stronger argument for why the capture of Valencia was Suchet's greatest moment? So this is what came out of it. Marshal Louis-Gabriel Suchet, one of Napoleon's most capable generals, is best remembered for his exemplary command during the Peninsular War, particularly his conquest and governance of Aragon and Valencia in Spain. His greatest moment is widely considered to be the capture of Valencia in January 1812. Why the capture of Valencia stands out. Military achievement, Suchet managed to trap and capture a Spanish army of 18,000 men under General Blake, an impressive tactical victory that few other French marshals achieved in Spain. Strategic importance, Valencia was one of the most significant cities in eastern Spain, taking it consolidated French control over a large swathe of the eastern coast. Napoleon's recognition, this victory earned Suchet a marshal baton. A rare honour during the Peninsular War, he was the only French general promoted to marshal during the campaign. Effective governance, unlike many of his counterparts, Suchet did not just conquer territory, he stabilised and administered it well. He earned a surprising degree of local cooperation, largely through fair taxation, respect for local customs, and efforts to rebuild infrastructure. So I wasn't satisfied and I asked for more. And I got this. 1. The only marshal crowned in Spain. Out of all of Napoleon's commanders in the brutal, drawn-out Peninsular War, Suchet was the only one promoted to marshal specifically for his success in Spain. Napoleon famously said, "If I had 2 Suchets in Spain, the war would be over." That's not just praise, it's strategic endorsement. Unlike Michel Ney or Soult, Suchet proved that France could win and hold territory in Spain, which was otherwise a military graveyard for the empire. Operational mastery at Valencia. Suchet didn't just take the city, he executed a near flawless encirclement and siege, pinning down General Blake's army of over 18,000 troops. This was one of the largest single capitulations of Spanish forces during the entire Peninsular War. There are then a series of bullet points, the first of which is, he crossed a flooded river. Okay then. He cut off escape routes. He used precise artillery and disciplined infantry coordination. The result was Blake was forced to surrender with minimal French casualties. That's operational art at its finest, clean, decisive, and almost bloodless. A rare instance of French control that actually worked. Spain was known for chewing up French armies, not just military, but politically and administratively. Cities like Madrid and Seville had to be reconquered multiple times, but not Valencia. Under Suchet, the region remained stable and even economically productive for the empire. There are a couple of more points, but we've run out of time on the 2.5 minutes. So there you have it. That is AI's take on Suchet. And I was actually surprised that Josh didn't have his head in his hands. So before we just kind of open things up properly to the floor, judges, your reaction to the AI explanation of Suchet's kind of greatest moment, please. Josh?
It's a fairly standard appraisal of the Siege of Valencia. It seems to hinge quite a lot on how many men were captured. Suchet outnumbered the Spanish, so that's not really a factor, and it's rather a weak end of the argument. It doesn't understand the bullet points, but it is probably correct that Valencia is probably Suchet's greatest moment because he gets the baton for it. What do you think, Catherine?
Zach turned around and said, I can't believe that I can't see Josh's head in his hands, and I can only imagine it's because his sunglasses are hiding his tears. I thought that ChatGPT gave exactly the same kind of bland list of responses that it does to literally everything. And it's incredible that you can detect the exact cadence that it uses in every single answer. How do I improve views on this blog post? Well, firstly, and then this, and so on. And so, yeah, I sort of ended up, I feel, almost drifting off because every other person speaking like a human is engaging, can actually weigh up decisions or opinions in a human matter. And here we get something almost completely irrelevant tied in with possibly the most important aspect of this man's life, bless him. So I feel as if it does a great disservice to Suchet, I have to say.
I read it and went, well, that's very GCSE history, isn't it? In terms of its response. That, you know, if, and then this is why I'm not particularly concerned at this moment in time that Chat GPT is coming for my job, because, I mean, look, it's very impressive that it can churn out sort of a decent sort of middle of the range 15-year-old's analysis of Suchet. But like, is this tool about to go and write a book on, I don't know, crime and punishment in the British Army because somebody's sad enough to ask it about that? No, I don't think so. I think I'm good for a little while yet. And John comments in the chat, if this podcast is listened to in the future, he welcomes and thanks our AI overlords for this dynamic take on Suchet. Smart. Now it's time for the open floor debate. And last time we started up the open floor debates, I'm surprised that somebody didn't walk out with sort of fresh scars because it was brutal.
I'll fire the first salvo. I would say I think that the use of a 5-year administrative appointment as a singular moment is a bit broad, and I think just unfairly goes against, a few days of hard fighting campaigning. So I think, well, actually, I also do very much like Marmont, and he's definitely my vibes marshal. Like, there could have been so many interesting, like, what ifs with him and all that. I just think that in terms of the criteria, it's a little too broad, with all due respect, of course.
Well, of course, it wasn't just administrative appointments. Marmont had to go and fight in Ottoman territory, for example. Well, first of all, they had to win Dalmatia. So, that wasn't an administrative task. There was a big Russian force to be budged. They didn't take any notice of the treaty. The Austrians may have buggered off, but not the Russians. So there's plenty of fighting to do, and then he had to go get stuck in with the Spahi and the Seconds and all the others on the Ottoman side. Something the Austrians singularly failed to do, I might point out. And then he did the administrative bit. But I accept that, if you had the actual marshals in the room today, they would be making lots of arguments against Marmont because they were intimidated by him. He was an intellectual. They were just soldiers who plodded around, whereas Marmont could do the whole thing. He was a business. So I understand the difficulty, but, you are what you are.
I can't call them non-intellectuals when Saint-Cyr's in the room.
That's true.
In fairness, I would concede Saint-Cyr,
although he had the artist's folly of melancholy, I suppose, as well, which I don't think Marmont necessarily struggled with.
No, true. No. Marmont, of course, did publish 4 works, so two of which were military ones. So I'm playing to Catherine's artistic taste here with blatantly pointing out that Marmont could write the classics as well, and which I doubt many others, possibly Saint-Cyr, I concede, might have managed a tad of a go at that.
So that's the nerds battling it out there. That's Saint-Cyr and Marmont going at it, saying, "I can paint better than you can, and I can administer the heck out of Dalmatia." What can you do? What have we got for the fighters, chaps? Come on.
Sorry, I am going to come for Murat, surprising absolutely no one. Um, Obviously, Eylau does show Murat at his unarguable best. He was the first cavalryman of Europe, but if Davout hadn't turned up when he turned up at Eylau, does that turn in from being a bloody stalemate potentially to a loss for the French? So it's quite interesting when you look at so many of the other marshals' finest hours, how often Davout's timely arrival or support kind of brings that on.
Fine point, Rachel. I'm not arguing against it. I just to lead what is considered one of the greatest cavalry charges in history in a snowstorm against the Russians, very tough army, and to live through it without a scratch is pretty incredible.
Wasn't it an easier charge because it was a snowstorm? I mean, no one could see his daft clothes. Yeah,
They couldn't see the sparkle on him. Yeah, you're right.
it's camouflage.
Yeah, fine point, Rachel. I just think it. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, and also an interesting way to cut down Murat and also give a little pat on the back to Davout at the same time. Like in the same criticism, also saying actually Davout here, if you look at this.
He
So
does
that was
turn
well
up
done.
exactly when he's needed.
I must say, Ney is sitting there very quietly. Very quietly.
This is very unlike Ney.
Indeed.
Here, I'm going to go after Davout. Okay, Auerstadt. Then what? I mean, that's your greatest glory there, right? For the Marshal. He was very tepid. He had very little charisma. He was a family man for sure. But I don't know. I don't think he ever took risks very much. He was he was definitely a tactician. But the guy kind of was in the background for a lot of the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, he was the governor of Hamburg. So I mean, I do believe what distinguishes the two, Ney and Davout, is fortune does favor the brave, and sometimes Ney would take risks, and sometimes he'd get it wrong, but at least he was there doing it in the major battles. And I would argue that Davout would often get things like take care of Paris and make sure they don't backstab Napoleon. I mean, I think if Napoleon didn't write Davout's orders, I think Davout would I don't know. I don't know if we even would know who Davout was. So I don't think Davout had the creativity to do more than follow orders. And so, does that make a great marshal? I don't know.
That's quite a barrage you just launched there, Ney.
I mean, if ever there was a meme to drop into this conversation, that's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see how it plays out for him.
I mean, I would argue that the world would be significantly better off with more boring, competent people in charge and less people who go off half-cocked without having two brain cells to rub together. And that's not a dig at Ney, but that's more a case of if people thought through things a little bit more, we'd all be infinitely better served. But in terms of, Davout not participating, he participates in every campaign from 1805 onwards. He's never decisively defeated. No, he's not charismatic. No, he's not particularly warm individual. For me, he's the direct comparison. He's Francis Wellington. And that's not just because they've got metallurgic nicknames, but that's where I think the similarities are. He turns up exactly when he's needed at Austerlitz. He holds the right at Wagram. He turns up when he's needed at Eylau. He gets the victory at Etnol. All of these are big, significant Napoleonic victories. You take Davout out of the equation, what potentially happens after that? His corps is in such good condition, they can be trusted to go anywhere. There's no pillaging, there's no rape, there's no, essentially the carnage that some of the other marshals create. And if you look at Ney has incredible highs, but he has significant lows. And this, I'm sort of eating into my argument for the next round. Davout is Mr. Consistency. He's never decisively defeated. He is consistently excellent. Ney's high, low, high, low. And arguably, Ney's sometimes poor judgment puts his own back against the wall, and it's Davout who acts to save Ney. And they're not bosom buddies either. Davout acts at significant cost to his own life to try and get Ney out of the mess he gets himself into. So I would argue that actually thinking things through and a bit less grandiose speeches would serve all of us a little bit better.
Well, no doubt you can't lose battles when you're in the auxiliary, you're in the back, you're not leading from the front. And sorry, just can't get away with that. Ney was a leader. He was getting in the fight and getting it done. Well, Davout's in the back going, checking out the plan, back in the auxiliary and leading,
This is a very Ney way of fighting this. I have to say.
Ding ding.
Charge!
Ding ding.
Right.
Time, folks, please. Because at this point I'm going to weigh into this and I'm going to burst Todd's bubble because I know Josh's views on Ney's withdrawal and rearguard action in Russia. And I think we are of one mind, Josh, when I say that the idea that you command the rearguard and barely manage to cut your way out when you've been encircled because you've screwed up and allowed yourself to be encircled, and you have 90% of your original force with you, that's really not the flex that people tend to think it is. And in fairness to Todd, like this is a line of argument that comes up time and time again. Todd is not the problem here. It's the way in which people interpret that event that means that actually, if that is Ney's greatest moment, like getting cut off and barely getting out alive, that says a lot about how bad Ney's other moments were. Am I right, judges?
One of the things which I was surprised to not hear, to be honest, with Ney, and again, this may be slightly controversial, but it's that I think you could argue that Ney's death was possibly one of his finer moments. Now, what I would say here is that if you were to take that kind of logic and say, look, this is a, I don't know, you might want to say particularly noble, maybe even martyred death, could we not also apply this to Marshal Murat? I mean, there's a slight difference in that Murat is getting almost torn apart by his own people, of course. There's a slight lack of dignity to that. But I did want to sort of put this out there and say, is there anyone brave enough willing to say that the death of their marshal is potentially one of their finer moments?
I mean, it would have been a definite strong case if somebody had. It's something like I can envisage Alexander Mickey-Bereze, who gallantly defended Bernadotte in the last round, doing something like that. But you can only do that with a handful of them, I suppose. But it would have been an interesting way to go for sure. And yeah, I'm always going to have a few problems with Ney in Russia, just because of the practicalities of actually what happened to make him the bravest of the brave. Maybe it is his greatest moment. It's certainly the moment that people know him best for. So that it's valid to make the argument. As for Davout not being at the forefront of everything as he should be, he might have been pounding on the wrong door there, just a little bit. The Davout, I mean, every 19th century, every 18th century general, whether he is a vanguard commander or a rear guard commander or a guy you want with the troops, with underneath the commanding general, they all expose themselves to the fire of the enemy. They all generally see themselves, are seen by their troops, and in defense of Davout's courage and position in the army, he a lot of lead missed him at Eylau and at Auerstadt. So I don't think his call was ever considered. I don't think his call was ever considered to be a reserve either. In fact, it was considered to be one of the finest in the Grande Armée. Now, if we turn that around, I'm not just going to be beating on Ney's hat here, because Davout. I noted that Rachel was very careful to use the word decisively. Davout was never decisively defeated, because Miloradovich pops him in 1812 during the retreat, and that is an example which kind of goes to show the collision between Ney and Davout, because here's Davout being defeated by someone who is considered a lesser commander, and by troops who are sometimes considered lesser troops than certainly Davout's troops. But once Davout's corps breaks, pretty much everybody says that's the end for the army. It's not the guard. It's when Davout's corps breaks that everybody says, all right, this is serious now. So, it's interesting to see them pitted against each other that way.
I suspect a lot of that's going to have relevance when we come to judging round two. But what we need to do is work out who's going to make it to round two. And what I've been sort of trying to think about as I've gone through these is how big a deal is each of these individual moments? Because if this is the greatest moment of these folks, how much of an impact does that have on Napoleonic France and their capacity to wage war? So we could debate Todd's argument vis-a-vis the rear guard, but there is an argument to be made that if nothing else, hell, they hold up the Russians, and that occupies forces that might otherwise have been used to cut up the French army elsewhere. Auerstadt breaking the Prussian army. Come on, we're not seriously going to sit here and say, "Oh no, that's not really that important." Like that's a minor blip on the historical radar. Oh no, folks. Just think about what Blucher wants to do when he gets into Paris several years later. I think that says it all. Dresden's an interesting one, as is Eylau. I tell you the one that I'm coming for. It's ChatGPT. Because how much impact does, and this isn't to take anything away from the nature of the achievement itself. Yes, Suchet is the success story amongst a series of very unfortunate failures. He's ChatGPT is sort of knocking on the door of a much more pertinent point, which is that Suchet is the rare exception of the generals who comes out of the Peninsular War with a reputation bolstered. And there's sort of been a knocking on the door of that in the response. But he doesn't single-handedly save the Peninsular War for the French, which kind of means that actually success, as successful as he may have been, maybe it doesn't actually matter that much. And all that he does is end up prolonging the Peninsular War, because a weaker French presence on the east coast of Spain might have encouraged the French to evacuate sooner. Obviously, we're into counterfactuals there. So I'm kind of leaning towards the idea that that Suchet, Lord love him, he ain't gonna make it through. That's where I'm at, judges. What are your takes?
Yes, I'm inclined to cast a rather critical gaze at Suchet in this competition. So if Valencia is his finest moment, and by extension, it was trying to argue kind of for the governorship of an as well. So that's a point to you, Dave. The other problem that you have with Suchet is that although he is a certain he's one of the category that sort of comes out of the staff side of things. He comes up as staff officer and then shows tactical flair, and he's good at organization. But again, the impact is not great. He's never seen as a guy that Napoleon needs to have in the army. He trusts him with independent command, and I place a lot of value on that. But He does get actually defeated on the battlefield, first by Blake at the beginning of the Peninsular War, secondly by the British. Is it Murray that gets him as well? He's not first class when it comes at all times. He is of a very high grade, but when compared with some of the other marshals we're dealing with here, I think it's fairly easy to put him in a sort of in danger of being kicked out of the balloon.
Catherine?
I enjoyed your slightly unorthodox logic when it came to Suchet and ChatGPT. And again, I'm just going back to my sheer hatred of the form in which it takes. But it was so much more mediocre than your guess. It really was, wasn't it? I mean, it was appalling. And so I'm very, very happy to boot that thing from the balloon as soon as humanly possible so that we don't have to listen to any more bland listicles coming out of it.
So Catherine doesn't so much want to throw Suchet out of the balloon so much as just chat GPT in general. Duly noted.
As it is, it's even again in a competition called Greatest Marshal, you're trying to find the greatest marshal, whatever that means. In the previous episode, I eliminated probably someone. I voted to eliminate someone who is easily considered one of the top three popularly. Suchet is not popularly considered the top three. And for that reason alone, I wouldn't have seen him advancing in these ranks very far.
Okay, it sounds like that's a decision made. So Suchet falls. We're going to blame it on ChatGPT. Suchet falls because of artificial intelligence. There we go. ChatGPT, it seems, is thrown from the balloon. And doubtless, sort of, there is a whole series of sort of dots and whistles and ones and zeros that it shouts on its way down to the ground. So that leads us on to round two, which is each contender's more general military record. So in this round, our lovely guests will be making the case for the more general military capabilities and military impact of their chosen marshal. And this time we're going to go in reverse order. So Dave, you're up first with Marmont. 2.5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Zach. Well, I suppose the first thing to say about Marmont was that he was a proper soldier. He trained for the role in the artillery, an arm reserved for those who could at least add up, which is more than we said for many others. His early military service, his highlights included being Bonaparte's aide-de-camp in Egypt, and where he won distinction and promotion. He organised the artillery in the subsequent Italian campaigns. He commanded the corps at the Great Manoeuvre of Ulm in 1805. He was there from start to finish, doing the difficult jobs. Well, I said earlier, his real skill was in independent command. He wasn't sitting there in most cases being supervised by Napoleon. He won much of Dalmatia with a small army, 2 divisions, again, despite a powerful Russian force, as I said in response to an earlier point. He also had to deal with local potentates. And, there's a bit of a myth in some Napoleonic thinking that the Ottomans were the sick man of Europe. That was actually later. They still could pack a punch in this time. And let's remember that Ali Pasha, one of those potentates, defeated a French army before Marmont came on the scene. And neither was this an unimportant area. Napoleon once said that Corfu was more important than Sicily to him. So these were important factors militarily. In the 1809 campaign in Dalmatia, leading to the Battle of Graz, and he provided, as a result of his manoeuvres, an extra corps at Wagram, which Napoleon certainly needed. And John Elting, the historian, calls this a remarkable 300-mile march through frequent roadless country, scattering 2 Austrian forces and clinging to his independent status. So he fought in challenging conditions with successful incursions into Bosnia to defeat Ottoman forces, deterring raiding The Austrians couldn't do the same over decades. Yes, when he went to Spain, Napoleon turned to Marmont for another independent command. He outmaneuvered Wellington, the relief of Ciudad Rodrigo. Yes, he was defeated at Salamanca, but he was wounded early in the battle. He recovered to command of corps in the 1813 campaign.
John, you're up next for Murat.
Thank you, Zach. For his military record, I went and looked at the Bible of Napoleonic Battles. That's the Green Hill Data Book by the great Digby Smith. 14 wins, 5 losses for Murat. I think should be included in that, though. The 1795 13 Vendémiaire, critical that Murat went and retrieved cannons for Napoleon from the Sablon artillery park, bringing them to Napoleon so he could mow down the royalist mobs that were trying to overthrow the government. So credit to Murat there, because it was almost like a Bond movie, because the royalist mob also was sending troops to get those cannons. So big props to Murat there. How many other marshals took a bullet to the face? I'll wait a moment while you guys answer that one. Yeah, the answer is none. All right. So in 1799, at the Battle of what was that battle? Oh, Abukir. He captured the enemy commander, this guy Mustafa Pasha. Murat led his cavalry through his lines of Turkish troops, ran into the tent, took a bullet to the face, chopped off this guy's fingers, and captured the enemy commander. Pretty impressive. Okay, so I'm doing pretty well so far, and we're not even to the good stuff yet. He performed well also in the Ulm campaign and at Austerlitz. Some say it was suspect commanding of Ney's troops around Ulm, but other than that, he did very well at Austerlitz, very well at the Battle of Dresden, and I think overall in the Russian campaign, Murat did a good job. I know he took a loss outside of Moscow, but for the most part, he had the sword in the kidneys of the Russians all the way to Moscow. I think if you look at his overall military career, it was very impressive.
Beautifully done there, John. Thank you very much. Next up, Noah, it's Saint-Cyr time.
Excellent. So I will say that I guess somewhat like Marmont, Saint-Cyr could count, and he showed early a talent for staff work. He was able to apply his perhaps somewhat morose intelligence and his talent for drawing to go through topographical maps and create some interesting items that caught the eye of French commanders. So he was promoted to General Coustine's staff and was also then attached as chief of staff to various divisions as well. Like many revolutionary generals, but still incredibly impressive, he moved from the rank of captain to a brigadier general with under 2 years, and then was also general de division in 5 days after his promotion to a general officer. Within that, it was not just necessarily granted to him. He was also entrusted with corps command in the Army of the Rhine 2 years later, in 1796. He was able to bounce back a bit between the Rhine and in Italy. He had some personality issues with Massena, since he was very against looting, so he was very much in favor of order and what his morality, would allow in the conducting of war. He successfully extricated his wing from Novi during that disastrous battle, so he was able to provide support in trying to salvage the French forces there. Unfortunately, he was then sidelined based on more political concerns, since he had a distaste of Napoleon's coup of Brumaire and was kind of like Lannes, exiled to a diplomatic role in the Iberian Peninsula for a time, and when he did not support the declaration of the empire, he was similarly sidelined to the periphery, to Naples, in which he clashed with Massena again. He was then kind of out of favor from beyond 1805 and 1806. He was able to gained some command for the Peninsular campaign and won several victories on the approaches to Girona in that siege. He, however, had, I will admit, a very dark moment in which he was accused of improperly transferring his command to Augereau, and that left him out in the doghouse for another few years. He won his baton in Russia, leading the 6th Bavarian Corps and trying to extricate.
Thank you, Noah. So next up, Davout, Rachel, the floor's yours.
Okay, with some apologies for repeating some of the points I made in defending him in the last round. I know his nickname was the Iron Marshal, but I do think Davout could be summed up as Monsieur Le Cohérence. He is Mr. Consistency. He participated, as I said, in every campaign from 1805 onwards, but had served to great success in Egypt as well. Like Marmont, he had studied to be a soldier. He had slightly more royalist connections, but embraced the revolution, even though it didn't bode particularly well for him at the time. His mother ended up imprisoned. But like I say, I feel like Davout plays a very key part in a lot of the big French victories of the time. And as I say, when I was going through the list, kind of trying to populate what I thought each marshal's greatest moment was, he keeps cropping up again and again. He marched his men 70 miles in 2 days, which for the time is a particularly impressive feat, and arrived exactly when he was needed to then fight. His corps fought brilliantly at Austerlitz. Again, Eylau arrives when he's needed, helps to turn the potential defeat into a stalemate. Again, at Wagram, which we could potentially argue was one of Marmont's finest moments, again, he crucially holds the right. And this is soon after his key victory at Eckmühl. But I think one of the things that really elevates Davout is the order, the discipline, and the brilliant logistics that are behind the Third Corps. They're generally accepted to be one of the finest corps in Napoleon's Grande Armée, and that's down to him. That's not a fluke. He concerned himself with every minutiae. When you read his correspondence, even down to things like how much bread or how much flour each soldier should carry, and whether they would have enough kettles for his soldiers to make their soup. Even in Russia, right at the end, his men are the last to break. He's capable of successful independent command. He holds Napoleon. He's instructed to hold Hamburg for Napoleon, Dusseldorf for over a year. Only surrender when he gets confirmation of that abdication. And if you want to talk about administrative work, the nigh miracle he works in raising the army to fight at Waterloo is pretty exceptional. Throughout his career, he exercises a really
It feels deeply unpleasant for Rachel to have been cut off there by Ridley Scott. I dislike that intensely. And last, but by no means least, Marshal Ney.
Marshal Ney. He ran away from his death jog in 1788 to join Hussar Regiment. His opportunity came with the Revolutionary Wars, in which he fought from early engagements at Valmy and Jemappes in 1792 to the final battle of the First Republic in Hohenlinden in 1800. The early campaigns revealed two contrasting features of Ney's character: his great courage under fire and his strong aversion to promotion. Willing to hurl himself into battle at critical moments to inspire his troops by his personal example, he was unwilling to accept higher rank, and when his name was put forward, he protested to his military and political superiors. In every instance, he was overruled. It was as general of the division that he fought in Victor Moreau's army at the Rhine at Hohenlinden. When Napoleon led his armies in the swift marches into the heart of the continent after a new European coalition of Russia, Austria, and England had been formed against France, the first victory was won by Ney at Elchingen in October of 1805, where he was created the Duke of Elchingen in 1808. And less than 2 months later, Napoleon defeated the Russo-Austrian armies at Austerlitz. Ney was active in defeat of Prussia at Jena in 1806 and of the Russians at Eylau and Friedland in 1807. When he was sent to Spain in 1808, his fame for personal bravery remained undimmed, and he did the best he could given the level of support provided by Napoleon. Let's face it, Napoleon was distracted. The Russian campaign of 1812 reestablishes a position on the morning after the somewhat inconclusive Battle of Borodino. Napoleon made him the Prince de la Moskva. On the retreat from Moscow, Ney was in command of the rear guard, a position in which he was exposed to Russian artillery fire and numerous Cossacks. He rose to the heights of courage, resourcefulness, and inspired improvisation that seemed miraculous to the men he led. And I would say you do take casualties when you're on the rear guard.
You think you're so great because you have boats!
Disagree with some of the disparaging comments made earlier. I guess I will end by saying, I will ask if there was any other marshal, including Murat, that had 5 horses shot out from under him in a battle. I think the answer is no.
All right. Again, Josh is pulling a face that looks rather like he's been invited to have sort of root canal without anesthetic in response to Todd's contributions there. But we shall save that reaction until after the open floor debate, where once again you can pull out the knives. It took you a while to warm to this idea of stabbing one another. Actually, to be honest, you weren't stabbing each other in the back, you were just stabbing one another in the face. But please return to that kind of mood. I'm here for it.
Well, I think there are several types of marshal for a start that you could have a look at. There are the staff type officers, the organizers. There are the fighters, and sometimes they're a mix of the two. But there are also, and this is where you can maybe get some ammunition to fire. There are also extremely good soldiers, some of whom, and I mean that, guys who were deemed excellent at battalion level, who rose from sergeants and clerks to become marshals. They're show soldiers in a way. Which of your opponents would you think is more of a show soldier elevated to the marshalate just because they show the genius of the French Republican Army? And which are actually marshals of the empire that can do anything, anywhere?
Well, everyone's promoted to their level of incompetence, I suppose, is the classic answer to that, and that's probably true in every profession and certainly every round of marshals. I suppose, it varies. I just think that there are, as you say, the beauty of the Republican Army was that people could actually get promoted on ability. And there were proper soldiers. Obviously, I'd argue Marmont was a proper soldier who always wanted to be a soldier. He trained properly for it there, and learned other skills as he went on, obviously. But in fairness to some of my colleagues here, that not every marshal got the opportunity to perform in every sphere of the role of a general officer, because the role in those days was much more than just leading troops on the battlefield. They had to do much more. They were almost always the governors, the military governors, even civilian governors of conquered territories in all countries. So it was a difficult task. Some had more opportunities than others, and some were better at it than others.
I think that's a really fair point. I'm sorry, I was just looking up. I knew there was a battle where Davout had 4 horses shot out from under him, and that was Austerlitz. So that's not bad for somebody that was always at the back. But I think Dave's made a really, really fair point in that opportunity was given to different degrees. And I think just linking back to what Josh was saying, there are loads of different types of marshals. And realistically, if we change the lens through which we're arguing this, we could have about half a dozen best marshals. Who's most essential? Who's most admirable? Blah blah blah. But I think when you look at the contenders we've got in front of us, because I'm noting the comment in the chat about my captures about Murat, is who demonstrates not just the physical courage. Because let's be realistic, if we're going to talk about flair and panache and who's the most daring, we could all see. We could say, look, fair dues to Murat. He was absolutely insanely brave. If you wanted somebody to charge at something, he's your man. But his judgment frequently was wanting. And that's where, Savary said if he had less bravery but more sense, he'd have been better served. I'm slightly more vulgar. He was all balls and no brains. And I think to be a really successful marshal, you'd need to have that combination of the two. It's not just enough to have the battlefield courage, although that's obviously essential. And if you look again, if you change the lens and say, well, who was the most inspiring? The rest of us could see to Ney and Murat, because obviously you get them up in front and make a speech. You're going to want to charge headlong into the enemy. under them. Would it get you killed? Possibly. I think that level of strategy of knowing when to be cautious and when to take the initiative, when it's you need to be concerned with the less dramatic, the less glamorous, the logistics, the supply, when you need to follow orders and when you need to take your own initiative. That's where I feel we could probably rank, in my opinion, Ney and Murat slightly further down. They were brilliant, undeniably at their best under Napoleon. But when they're given sort of more freedom to exercise their own judgment, they both have, superlative triumph, but fairly hefty drops as well. And that's why Davout ends up coming to blows, but well, not to blows, but metaphorically to blows with Murat and Russia, when he basically says, look, you can throw away your own men if you want, you bloody well won't throw away the lives of mine. And I think caution has to go hand in hand with a good general, because we're talking about human beings' lives. Yes, there's statistics. When do you conserve your men and when do you throw their lives away?
Spoken like a great armchair general, for sure. Look, if you want a guy that paints by colors, great. Davout's your guy. Okay. I'm sorry, Zach. He was Mr. Careful beyond belief. I just have to disagree. And then I in terms of Murat, the man, the myth, the peacock, right? I would love to have Murat charge beside me, but running your campaign or your country, no, thank you. I think, it's interesting. Murat and Davout are interesting characters, and why I don't think that they were the greatest. I certainly think they were up there, but not the greatest marshals. Is Davout just couldn't. He didn't have the creativity to do his own thing. He just took whatever Napoleon gave him. In terms of Murat, that guy couldn't run a complex campaign to save his life, and he didn't get one. I mean, Napoleon never put him in that. Really, rarely put him in that position. And then I think one last thing on Davout. I just feel that he was set up to appear as successful as he was, given the positions he was given. And I just have to say, I just think that no doubt he's great in many respects, but he would have been better if he was had a little bit more birdie egg in him to fulfill.
I get the distinct feeling, Todd, that you feel threatened by Davout.
Oh, you think?
Well,
oh, really?
Here's the thing, Josh. I'm Ney. I have to charge at probably the strongest enemy of the group.
But this is the thing. This isn't.
And I'm brash. If it makes sense or not, I have to do it.
Right.
But this isn't a Ney style. I mean, I have criticized and will continue to criticize Ney many times for losing that kind of sense of wider tactical awareness. But this isn't even a Ney style. Okay, there's a clear plan here, and there's sort of I've got a bit kind of sidelined and blinkered. This is a Murat style. I'm just gonna charge at something big and try and take it out style of approaching things.
On that subject, I think we should bring up something into the conversation about the value of some of these officers. Some of these officers are men that Napoleon trusted out of his sight. Some of these men are invaluable in his sight, in that they equalize themselves to some extent. So even if they are under Napoleon's orders, they're there because they are essential for the army to operate the way he needs it to operate. Now, we've batted Mr. Ostrich Feathers around a lot about this, okay? And so I'm going to maybe this will give John an opportunity to defend his guy for a second. But what I want people to remember about Murat is how often he was used, how often he was part of the main army. He was given I need to remind people that any officer who is given command of the cavalry reserve is the second in command of the army. Right? Now, in 1812, this is actually, it goes against Murat a little because obviously he fights his own war. But the point is, before that point, before 1812, everybody has their ups and downs, whatever. Murat is essential to the Grande Armée,
Yeah.
and he is. I would love to read more about him to see if actually he is as brainless as people think he was.
I don't think he was. And if you read some of his correspondences I have, he did have a thought in his brain. And I heard a dig that, maybe you don't want this guy running your country, but how well did the Duke of Wellington run his country? Just because you're good at one thing doesn't mean you're good at another thing. And Murat was very good as a cavalry commander. Napoleon was not in the business of promoting fools, and he trusted Murat well enough to marry his sister, for one, and two, to lead his cavalry reserve, as Josh mentioned. So I think he gets more flack than he deserves on his brains. He was a talented man, and I'll get into it in the third round, but I don't think any other marshal did as much as he did in his meteoric rise and fall.
Yeah, but I don't think that the Duke of Wellington would ever bite the Queen's or the King's hand, right? I would say that he was not a very loyal or faithful guy, and he bounced. I'd call him Mr. Flip Flop in terms of his politics,
Well,
and that got him into big trouble.
This calls back to an earlier episode when we were talking about Bernadotte, and in this episode, Noah, your guy, and practically every marshal, Dave, the infamous flip flop. What is loyalty?
He wasn't a flip flop at all. How was he a flip flop? He gave his oath and he kept his oath. That's not flip flopping. That's what men of honor do.
That's not my opinion. That is the opinion of France up until a certain point, and most Bonapartists today, as you said, this is, well defended. I agree, frankly. I mean, every marshal at one point betrayed Napoleon practically. So this is a. What do you got, Rachel?
I mean, again, I would say probably not. Sorry, I was just typing in to say not Davout.
Fair enough. Although he was probably getting close to it.
I think, in fairness, that's probably one of the things I would say tends to be less flattering to Davout. He was Bonapartist to the point of nigh fanaticism, which I don't think necessarily goes in his favour. But one thing I think you can't say is he didn't flip flop.
I want to defend Saint-Cyr a little bit from his accusation as a flip flopper as well. I don't know if that's necessarily as deserved. I think that there was, in some cases, similar to Marmont, he was trying to honor a higher cause. In terms of his personal morality, his belief in government. So we saw consistency in that, with the, not necessarily straight up opposing the coup Brumaire and the declaration of the empire. It was very lukewarm. It was very cold receptions, of course. And I actually think that speaks to Saint-Cyr's ability, that he clashed with Napoleon politically, in ways that were rather overt, at the head of troops in positions in Naples in Italy, in this kind of key part of the Napoleonic Empire. And yet he was brought back. He clashed with Massena, and yet he was brought back and then served in Spain, had his issue with the transference of command, and was brought back for Russia. And I would say also, like in Russia and also with the Dresden operations, those were points somewhat on the line of communication that if he fell at a certain point, then it could have been absolutely disastrous. So I think he was serving France in the sense that, even at Dresden, he was prisoner of war, so he kind of sat out seeing his homeland invaded. So it's very difficult to say how he would have reacted in 1814. But I do think that he more or less not spurned, but he remained relatively neutral with the first restoration, and then also with the 100 Days. He did come in after that, with the Bourbon side, but I think it was the clear duty to France, duty to Ney, to the army, his ideal of the citizen army. So you could argue that he did clash with Napoleon, and that might be the end all be all of being a flip-flopper. But I'd just say, similar to Marmont, I think he had that call to the bigger picture, to France, and also just some of his martially comrades.
But also within the context of this round, we're considering the more general military record. Actually, being a flip-flop, it's not hugely relevant to what we're discussing, is it? Catherine, perhaps you disagree with me on this, but please.
No, I sort of agree with you. Noah's completely correct on Saint-Cyr and his almost finer quality in terms of disagreeing with Napoleon at certain points. But to be honest, I think that it might actually be slightly more helpful to Rachel's argument here, because the fact that Davout is so dedicated to Napoleon and to Bonapartism is almost another example of his completely obsessive nature and his general wider total competency and consistency. I think you called him Mr. Consistency at one point. You have this complete devotion to logistics, this highly obsessive nature, which, as you say, exhibits itself politically and also militarily. I think that Bonapartism is just another element of this. In some ways, the way that you describe Davout, it's almost like proto-Prussian. the man's a military machine.
Just getting nods around the room in response to that. So I think what we can take from that is that Davout is safe in the basket at this moment in time. So the way to do this is potentially to whittle them down. I do take the point that Josh makes. Commander of the cavalry reserve is fundamentally 2IC on the battlefield, and for all that I am even more vociferous than Rachel in bashing Murat, like the guy had a use, and that use was multifaceted in the sense of inspiring. But the guy could command cavalry and could command cavalry very well, and that's not a skill to be sniffed at.
One of the toughest things you can do is be cavalry commander and be good at it.
Exactly. I mean, look at the British. The British cannot command cavalry for toffee, quite frankly. So I think Murat is safe, which is something that is probably going to surprise listeners in terms of me advocating for Murat. But maybe I'm softening ever so slightly. Maybe in my old age, or maybe it's Catherine's malign influence that's making me soften towards Murat. But either way, I think Murat is safe, which leaves us with Ney, Saint-Cyr, and Marmont. Now, I think Dave's been quite quiet, partly because we all know that Marmont has that problem that so many of the Peninsular War marshals have, which is that he has a Wellington problem. Now,
which is something that Suchet does not have.
This is true, but that's
I'd like to launch into Marmont if I could. Not a big fan of his 1814 to 1830. He claims he gave up Paris so there wouldn't be violence in Paris. And then in 1830, July Revolution, he's like, all right, I'm on board the Royalist train. I'll mow down everyone in Paris. And a failed effort to put down the rebellion there. So I just not buying Marmont's story all along.
He didn't do either of those. I mean, the point about 1814 was nothing to do with the state of Paris. It was to do with the fact that the war lost. Yeah, Napoleon couldn't see the war was lost. And Marmont, all the other marshals could, but it was Marmont who actually had the balls to do it. So that's the difference there. In terms of the other revolution, he was against the ordinances in the 1813 charge, and he was blamed by the royalists, but King Charles took him with him. The country. So yeah, King Charles recognised that they did his best in those circumstances, and he wasn't prepared to mow down lots of people, but still did his bit. So I think he did that. I mean, I have to concede I've no idea how many horses Marmont had shot under him. Probably not, but I have to say if there's an RSPCA vote here, I'm afraid getting the horses shot from under you doesn't seem to be the telling key point. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that was a fascinating attack, defense, and then attack on a third party. All of which I roughly agree with. That I feel sorry for the horses. It shows you were in the line of fire, but probably doesn't say a great deal more than that.
I mean, look, if we were assessing, who would be the best person to catch a shell, then Marmont does all right on that score, right?
Mm.
I'm sure it'd have been great at baseball. Let's put it that way. But that's not really what we're assessing here. I do think this is a chink in Marmont's armor. Like, obviously, there's the Salamanca issue. Now, the Salamanca campaign, very good,
Mm.
no disputing that. And yes, I do take the point. Fantastic at managerial stuff, but that's not military record in the fullest sense of the term. But 1814, just the campaign, his role within it, often criticized, not the greatest, not particularly inspiring. Um, and of course, Salamanca, like that ends up dominating how we think. So, and when it comes to his elevation, he's described as friendship's choice, right? I'm not feeling it with Marmont, which pains me. Now, the thing is, Ney doesn't come out smelling of roses from this either. I don't blame him for Quatre Bras in the slightest. That's not his fault. I don't blame him half as much as people do for Waterloo either, because he's been given a task. And he does that. He does absolutely do that thing that he does repeatedly, though, which is he never sees the bigger picture, or he often fails to forget the bigger picture, and he becomes too blinkered and too focused on an individual tactical point of on the battlefield, and that is a big problem for a guy at this level. So I do think Ney is weak, but I don't know how I feel about Saint-Cyr. Judges?
Saint-Cyr is incredibly interesting. He's also one of the lesser cared about marshals, not lesser known, lesser cared about. Um, I have a lot of time for him because he's not perhaps the ideal of a sort of like image of a marshal. However, on the other hand, he is in a way because he's one of those examples of the system working. He comes from very low rank to the highest rank, and he does that generally just because of his own competence. I don't know if we're ready to kick him out, but the problem is you're dealing with a reputation in the room, and that is Ney. Ney has a reputation in the army. He has a reputation historiographically. Um, and the question is uh, kind of whether or not you can sort of countenance getting rid of Ney in favor of one of the others at this point. I wouldn't say he's not in danger because I know you, Todd, you gallantly try to defend him in Russia again, but he gets into that position because he he does get isolated, he does get left behind, but he chooses to fight on, completely loses the action, entire corps is shattered by the Russians, and then he is forced to get what is left of them out. Otherwise, he's going to get surrendered, right? It's he's going to get it's his only chance. It's his only hope. It's a complete disaster of his own making. It's an amazing feat that he gets 600 guys out, but he did have a lot more men 3 days before or whatever. So that's Ney is a great marshal. But he's not out of danger of losing out to one of the others at the moment because of Russia. Oh, now, if you'd have gone with Elchingen and gone with some of those battles and stuff like that, where he's Duke of Elchingen,
Yeah.
before he's the Prince of Moskva, maybe that would be stronger ground.
No, but I think that there's a certain view of Ney here that I think is pretty judgy.
That's kind of what we're here for.
I know, I know.
We're judges, right?
But what I'm saying, but if there's, I always love Patton saying that if everyone's thinking the same thing in the room, no one's thinking. And he took chances, and sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. Okay, I get your point on Russia, but
Catherine?
I think that Josh did a really good argument in favor of perhaps Ney winning, or at least remaining through the next round, which is legacy, but not doing too well on this round, which is general record. And I have to say that Saint-Cyr has been put in slightly more eloquent terms than this. Just a brilliant man, absolutely brilliant. The other person I think who was struggling most on this general record, I have to say, I agree with Zach here. It's Marmont. Dave has done an incredibly good defense of him so far. Really, really knows his stuff, is really good at pitching it at the right level and trying to smooth over certain little cracks here or deficiencies. But I did notice that at one point, again, in trying to sum up his general military record, he emphasized the fact that he was incredibly intelligent. Absolutely. Brilliant. He included the fact that he was very well-rounded. Absolutely. And then he used the term usually delivered for his country. And I have to say that I think that this may be a slightly weak link.
So what we're coming down to,
he failed once in Salamanca when he was wounded. It's a bit tough, but that's what happens. Yeah, I mean, Davout, I think Davout's 30-mile march was very impressive, but Marmont did 300. In the toughest terrain around. I've been through that terrain, and this ain't the sort of Central Europe, etc. This is pretty rough stuff. So he only lost the one battle, and he lost that when he was wounded and laid up, and Clausel was doing the fighting. So I think other than that, all these other performances were very. I don't agree with Zach over the 1814. I think he was as good at 1814 as others were. In the other campaigns, I think some of them were exceptional, particularly the ones obviously, except I picked out the best ones. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting spin on Salamanca, considering that what gives Wellington the opening to then carry out his Viper strike is the fact that Marmont begins to lose a little bit of control, allows those two divisions under Thomier and McCune to march too far, and therefore don't have the support. So the opening that Wellington gets is because of Marmont dropping the ball a little bit, I would argue. Catherine?
He wasn't he'd have done what every other marshal did when it meant they make a recovery, and that's what happens. I'm not claiming Salamanca was his greatest day, but he wasn't there for most of the battle, but which is the defense for Salamanca. But everyone, because it's peninsula and the Brits were always obsessed by the peninsula, and we forget the rest of the Napoleonic Wars. And so I suppose to that extent, that will always be Marmont's weaker point. But if you look more broadly across the Napoleonic Wars in areas which are not as trendy or as obsessive for us Brits, at least those Brits in the room, then I think Marmont stands out in those areas.
This is the curse of the Peninsular Marshals, except for Suchet. And the reason it works out for Suchet, in large part, he's gone now, thanks to ChatGPT, is because he did not face Wellington, realistically speaking. So there's a very strong point there. I've always tried to give Marmont as much sort of credit as possible because of that reason. And for me, to be honest, it is weirdly sort of between Ney and Marmont.
Yeah, I agree. It's for me at this point, it's a choice. We have to choose between Marmont and Ney, and there's going to be a riot if we pick Ney and chuck him out the balloon. But I'm weighing this up, and it's not easy.
I'm not saying that Marmont will survive either. It's just at this time, I feel like Dave has put up a very good case to keep him. And so that means you have Saint-Cyr and Ney left. And between the two, so I'm going to mark Marmont safe, for my part.
And yet,
Oh,
and yet, if you look at Saint-Cyr's record, there is no Salamanca you have to try and defend. What is the black mark against Saint-Cyr?
The black mark against Saint-Cyr is that he does is that his well, I mean, he
As a
he
soldier,
he
I'd like to
he
clarify.
fails to take Girona for a start.
He
Not that
was
it's
ill. He
not
was
that it's
genuinely
not
ill.
that it's easy to take a Spanish city, as many people found out, but Suchet did, and we got rid of Suchet.
I get the feeling that Catherine is going to argue in favor of Saint-Cyr until her dying breath. Would that be fair, Catherine?
I probably wouldn't put it quite that explicitly, but I think you may see the general trend here. At the moment, I haven't really deviated from what I said before. I think that Dave's done an absolutely incredible job. I think outside of that, I'm not entirely convinced that his record is better defined necessarily as a military man than as a man. Nevertheless, I agree with you. I'm really struggling with Ney, and that sounds like an absolutely terrible thing to say. I really didn't think that I'd find myself in this position, but I still stick with my original thing, with my original comment, which was that I think that Ney could get through much more easily if this was legacy rather than military record. Do you think that's fair, Zach?
Yes, not least in terms of what he does for popular interest for the period. In part, Josh has alluded to this already. It's the Ney legend that people love about this period, and that does a massive service to Napoleonic history and getting people into the period. But that military record is based a lot on mythologizing and a lot of kind of, as I've said already, just kind of gung ho, let's go, as opposed to actually, do I need to storm this bridge that's like 6 foot wide and is representing a choke point from which my enemy can rain hell down upon me, as happens at the Coa. I feel like only Ney could win the Battle of the Coa and then lose it again by going, I know, I'm going to keep charging across this bridge that we've charged across several times before.
At the risk of elongating an impossible choice, I'm going to defend Ney at the car and say that the battle is his. He fails to finish off the British because he chooses to attack the stupid bridge, but he absolutely bundles them across that thing. And if it wasn't, we weren't dealing with the light division in Crawford, we would probably just rank it as a victory for the French, because he undoubtedly reported basically that I whipped the British across that that river, and they just managed to hold the other side of it. Is really what happens there. And Wellington, Crawford thinks he's going to get basically removed from command because of the Coa. That's a tactical mistake, but he does achieve a victory, I think, at the Coa River. But the principal thing with Ney is that he is a soldier's soldier. He's good at rear guards. He's good at divisional work. He's one of those divisional commanders who gets the job of a marshal. Um, but tied into that exuberance to attack the bridge, right, is the problem that even Napoleon has with him. At Waterloo, which I don't blame him for, I'm not going to hold Waterloo against him. Napoleon supposedly says something along the lines of he has compromised us like he did at Jena. And that is a reference to an attack under Napoleon's gaze, which was not supposedly authorized, that committed Napoleon to a battle before Napoleon supposedly thought he was ready to fight it. He has problems with Ney even when he's on a tight leash. He doesn't get on well with other commanders. He never gets an independent command worth noting, particularly. Massena was in a mess in 1811, but Ney doesn't make that easier. It's Ney's. I'm struggling getting rid of Ney off the bat just because everybody cheered up when Ney appeared in 1815. The redhead is here. Everything's going to be okay. The army loved him. The soldiers would fight for him. That's why he was essentially there.
But if he can't make it through the more general military record round, I this is difficult, but I
Because
think
because when you pose it against the likes of Marmont, what are the differences actually, really speaking? In fact, Marmont is given more independent command than Ney is. Ney fights Wellington multiple times. He does okay at well, actually, there's an interesting thing I've just gone through. He does okay at Quatre Bras, but like you said, Zach, whoever blinked first at Salamanca was going to get a devil of a pounding, and he blinked first. I'm going to still stick to my guns and say that I'd like to see what happens if Marmont goes forward, but I'm still having difficulty just because of the reputation that Ney had, getting rid of him in favor of Saint-Cyr.
see, I'm leaning towards. So my decision is between Marmont and Ney,
Right?
and I think I'm probably 51-49, leaning towards the elimination of Ney. That's how tightrope this is. Catherine?
This is exactly the same position I'm in. And I think that Josh is turning around and is saying, well, I'm having trouble getting rid of Ney because of the legacy. That's the entire point, isn't it? Zach put it perfectly well.
Because it's greatness in a nutshell.
It is, but it's reputational greatness.
It is.
It's the greatness in the eyes of the audience. But is it necessarily the type of greatness that this specific round demands?
Catherine,
Okay.
are you leaning towards Ney?
I'm afraid I'm going to stick my neck out. There's no knife to my back. There's no gun to my head. I'm afraid I'm going for Ney here.
And so the redhead falls. The horse has been shot from underneath him, and Ney is jettisoned from the basket. Folks, please continue to listen rather than throw your podcasting device of choice.
Just continue out of rage.
Please don't throw your phone at the wall. But feel free to jump in the comments and explain why we're all cretins for making this decision. That's totally fine. I'm here for that. But Ney is eliminated, and so therefore we must finally push on to the last round, the legacy of each contender. So one more needs to go, and we are going to start off with Rachel.
Okay, so general legacy, I could sum up Davout in one word: honor. He, as I've said, he is not the charismatic marshal. He's not the dramatic marshal. He is not the one who is necessarily inspirational, but his principles were ironclad. He was not for the chopping or changing, and his beliefs were based on what he thought was the right thing to do. Whether or not we agree with that's immaterial. He believed in doing the right thing. He lived and behaved honestly. And that was a sort of rarity, I feel, amongst the marshals. He was not one for backstabbing for backstabbing's sake. He was never one for self-aggrandizing. But the thing that really does sum up Davout's legacy for me is his role in trying to prevent the execution of Ney. And Ney's death for me is a bit of a litmus test for the marshals. Davout, as Minister for War, had negotiated the armistice, which had promised no persecution for those who fought at Waterloo. That obviously, of course, did not happen. Now, had he been more self-interested, as some of the other marshals might have been, Davout could have sat back, said, do you know what, that's a terrible shame, and done nothing about it. That was not his style. He had a wife and children to consider. It would have been presumably very easy to have kept his head down or to have tried to curry for favour, got back in the royalist camp. Very much not Davout. He initially had offered himself in favour of 4 prescribed generals in the Vendée, taking responsibility for their actions. He advised Ney to go for a court-martial, which Ney didn't go for, sadly. He and Ney were not close. This was not his. He was very good friends with Oudinot, good friends with Saint-Cyr. This was not a bosom buddy he was stepping in to rescue. But he agrees to testify at Ney's trial, goes in and again demands to be held responsible, admits that had he not thought that armistice conditions had been honoured, he would have given battle. At this point, they've already shot Le Bédoyère and others. Davout had to know he's essentially putting his back against the wall, or at least risking it. He testified anyway, very much because it was the right thing to do, and that's Davout to a T for me. Look, I'm not saying the guy has an ego, didn't have an ego. I'm not saying he was a saint, but he wasn't motivated by what was popular or, most dramatically what was of benefit to him. He did what he believed to be right, and that for me is a very different type of courage, but one nonetheless worthy.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Next up, Noah for Saint-Cyr.
This is the part where I admit I didn't think I was getting this far. But I think also then to start off, one has to fight the elephant in the room, not just display it, but fight it as well. Saint-Cyr's legacy is effectively that he has no legacy. The legacy is that he was a consistent soldier. He operated more so in the margins and did not necessarily have the bombastic death of a Ney or a Murat. I would say he's relatively like Davout, in several respects, in the sense that, um, he was a man of honor. He was a man, although perhaps more so of his own ego. Um, so he again fought for his ideal of France, for his ideal of morality, and again going to the more practical elements of what his legacy would be is the brief periods following the Bourbon Restoration and the 100 days. On the singular element, as Rachel brought up, his reforms to the army, trying to kind of make that meld between the restoration and the ideals of the revolutionary citizen army, and trying to marry those things in a way that France could move forward, socially and militarily. On the more personal element, again, similar to Davout, his desire to defend Ney and to support his comrades in the healing of France, after the grand era of death and destruction and division. So again, while he doesn't necessarily have the prime places in the history books, probably doesn't have the gaudiest statues. He has a legacy in that he established post-war France's military. He laid the foundry for that, and also greatly attempted to soothe divisions in a time in which France had been soaked with blood and tired beyond all possible respite. So, again, perhaps a man with no legacy, but that's legacy enough for him.
That's an interesting turnaround there. Thank you for that, Noah. John, you're up next for Murat.
What if I told you that a poor innkeeper's son would rise to be a successful general, a marshal of France, the brother-in-law of an emperor, king of Naples, and then issued what is considered the first call of unification of the great country of Italy? Well, it's all true. How many other marshals have reunified a country? In 1815, during the campaign against the Austrians, Murat issued what's called the Rimini Proclamation, or Proclamation Rimini, calling on all Italians to rise up and throw off the chains of their Austrian oppressors. Did it work? No. Marshal Murat, King of Naples, was shot by his own troops as ordered by the Bourbon kings and thrown into a common grave. But many consider that spark, that proclamation, to have reunified Italy decades later in 1861. Definitely has the greatest meteoric rise and fall of any of Napoleon's marshals, as I mentioned. But, I mean, what a life to do all of that, but before the age of 50, and take maybe 1% credit for reunifying Italy. Full praise to Marshal Murat, and what a great legacy. Thank you.
Short, sweet, and really sort of wholesome in terms of how you've supported everybody all the way through this evening, John. It's gone down very well amongst the judges. I'm not saying that's going to help Murat survive the basket, but like it has been noted.
Thank you.
Last, but by no means least, Marmont, Dave, the mic is yours.
Thank you. I think for Marmont, a bit like Saint-Cyr, I didn't quite expect to get this far, but looking at the question of legacy, I think if you look at Marmont's legacy, you have to look first out with France. You also have to look out with British Napoleonic historiography. Never say that word. He wrote his own memoirs, of course, and there are two obscure French biographies, but there isn't a general biography of Marmont. You also have to look out with the propaganda. The Bonapartists hated him because he didn't return to the fold in 1815. In my view, as I've said, he showed political judgment in doing that, and more importantly, honoured the oath he'd just given to the king. The royalists also disliked him because they claimed he didn't put down the 1830 revolution, although, as I said, the king took him with him, and in fact, he acted honorably there as well. In terms of legacy, if you go out with the peninsula and other parts of better known parts of Napoleonic War to Dalmatia, as I said earlier, his rule survives in public works and memory. Streets were named after him until World War II. How many occupying generals can claim that out with France? There's actually a very fine stone gazebo at Troguier that I'm going to throw into my argument. It's a small port on the Dalmatian coast where he played cards and debated philosophy with his aides. I tried to do the same. Sadly, they built a football ground next door and rather bashed and interrupted my philosophical discussion with my wife. Modern day tourists has a legacy because he built the original road routes that we use today. They didn't exist before Marmont did them there. So essentially, as I said earlier, he was an all-rounder. I like cricket, so it's a cricket analogy. He could bat at 5 and still bowl, and I think that's important. If you look at some of the great cricketers, the Ian Bothams of the world, he essentially was the Ian Botham of the Napoleonic marshals. Slightly more flippantly, I'd say his equestrian portrait is, in my view, easily the best of all the marshals. It's bold, authoritative, without being flashy. I'm not getting at anyone in particular. And he, of course, was the last surviving marshal. He also died in Venice, which I think showed great style as well. So all in all, a fine, rounded
I wasn't expecting died in Venice to be used as an argument in favor of survival. Okay, do you know what? Out of all of the, I thought this is completely kind of ended up going on its head in terms of how I thought this would go. And I'm feeling more the idea that Marmont's legacy is kind of significant, partly in the role of ending the war rather than dragging it out. And that kind of that sense of, yes, everyone's going to hate this because I'm praising Marmont for, inverted commas, doing the dirty on Napoleon. But by having that sense of the war is over anyway, we just need to stop. Actually, that's a really significant legacy in terms of saving lives. And that's the real legacy of a good commander, to achieve what is, necessary from a tactical perspective or a strategic perspective at the minimal loss of life. And sure, we're talking about a surrender here, but sometimes you need to know when a surrender is actually the only viable option. And I would argue that's what Marmont does. So I'm already starting to think that Marmont's going to make it through to the public vote, which I did not expect. At the start of this, I thought it was going to be a three-way fight between Davout, Murat, and Ney for the public vote. So I'm baffled by this already, but we are going to have that free-ranging debate. And hey, there's something to for you all to sink your teeth into. One of your judges thinks that Marmont is safe. You want to pile on Marmont?
See, I genuinely agree with you, Zach, and I think Marmont gets way more stick than he ever deserves. Because ultimately, when the Allies are at the gates of Paris, knowing when blind loyalty into the gates of hell, I don't think is a virtue. You need to know when to stop. But the thing that taints Marmont's legacy for me, and I've saying, Ney's death for me, it genuinely is a bit of a litmus test. He's one of the marshals who votes to see Ney shot. And for me, that is inherently distasteful. This is a comrade, not necessarily one he's got on particularly well with. Ney had a very good talent for pissing other marshals off. But this is still a man who, regardless of whether you got on with him, who has fought for France, bled for France, sacrificed, every imaginable thing you could have asked of him. He's been eliminated for obvious reasons, but he is still Ney, the bravest of the brave, a man who has proven himself on the battlefield 1,000,000 times over, and Marmont votes to have him shot. And that's the one bit of Marmont I just can't reconcile myself with.
Yeah, but he did. I mean, I accept that. Although, I suppose all I'd say is that first of all, Ney didn't have to be shot. Ney had plenty of get-outs at the end of the day. There were plenty of opportunities there, and he chose, for whatever reason, not to take those. Remember, in most countries, it wouldn't have got to a vote of the soldiers. I mean, if this was a Russian general who did that, he'd be hung up. So I think there's a, at the end of the day, it was treason. You'd be strung up in Britain for it. You'd certainly be shot out of hand in Russia for it. At the end of the day, that's what happens when you commit treason, and you actually don't take the opportunities of escaping either.
Or was he shot?
Oh, good question. Yes.
No, we're not doing that one. No, John.
That's a whole new podcast.
We're not
He's
getting
trying
into
to
that.
sabotage your podcast, Zach.
A humble school teacher with a marshal's baton.
Look, I invite you on here, John. This is meant to be a respectable show. Don't start bringing your conspiracy theory. Although, actually, to be honest, if we started bringing conspiracy theories into the offering, we might actually do better in terms of our ratings. So maybe you're onto something, and maybe I should indulge that. Noah, you're sitting there very quietly.
Yes. Again, I think that there's a great stain on Saint-Cyr in the sense that if you ask the average Frenchman, maybe maybe Frenchman's perhaps a little too, not giving me enough credit, but who your favorite marshal is, I think probably 0 out of 100 would say Saint-Cyr. So again, I it's very difficult to defend someone who has not the same great achievements. I think with all credit to John and his incredible defense of the dandy marshal, I think the only thing I would like to put against that is in the sense that ultimately Murat was rejected by the Italians, and that the Italians ended up unifying Italy. I would even argue that Napoleon had a greater part in fostering that initial Italian nationalism through the various republics that were created. So I don't necessarily feel that we can count today's current united Italy as a salient part of Murat's legacy. Again, I very much open myself up because the counter is, so what does Saint-Cyr add to this? Again, it's very much in the weeds of he helped make post-war France. But to what degree? Was it himself versus the actions of many? And again, he's not nearly the romantic figure of Murat, as I'm sure John will point out. And that's, again, I can only say so much against that because I know the very precarious position I myself am in.
He was also the only marshal to surrender Saint-Cyr. So there's that. There's that. Back at you, Noah. But you're right. Was Murat directly responsible for reunification of Italy? Probably not, but just that spark was there. Sorry, Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, so there are two things. Firstly, with regards to unification of Italy, like valiant attempt, but I think a guy called Garibaldi is entering the chat at this point in time. If not entering the chat, then he's turning in his grave at the suggestion that we need to give the credit to Murat. But what I will say is that Murat has a Ney factor. We've just talked about this idea that you have somebody like Ney who would romp through this round on the basis of sheer, public delight in terms of how he is remembered. And Murat, for all that I bash him, why do I bash him? Because he's a caricature, because he's a character, because there is charisma in there. There's lots that you can latch onto and use to inspire people. Catherine.
You're completely correct when you say he is just charisma. There's a point in which earlier on I really didn't want to interrupt because I was saving it for this round, in which we were discussing whether Murat is brainless. And he's not brainless whatsoever. I mean, John understood this perfectly well. He's came through his letters. He understands this is an intelligent man. He's at least a clever man. But what Murat is he's just a deeply sensual man in the most literal sense of this. He's guided by his senses. He's owned by his senses. He's dominated by his own senses. Napoleon has this thing about Murat, right? All he needs is sort of wine, women, a groaning table. Quite often, I think these three are maybe entwined, but that's a conversation for another day. And I think that in many ways, Murat is sort of, we're talking about you can just throw him at anything, right? And you use all these kind of bombastic words. You can just throw him at that. He'll just barge into that. It's sort of all of this kind of stuff. You have this situation in which Murat is kind of what people would rather distastefully refer to as cannon fodder. He's sort of impulsive, he's erratic, he's the type of man that's literally just thrown at the enemy. But he's that rare kind of cannon fodder that absolutely thrives in this environment.
Yeah, I mean the thing that distinguishes Murat from Ney, and I was out. If we had got down to a full vote, I would have been outvoted anyway because I would have saved Ney and probably kicked Saint-Cyr. But the thing that distinguishes Ney from Murat is that Murat is really central to a lot of what Napoleon does, to Napoleon's career. There's arguments towards the beginning of that career that without Murat, it doesn't happen. Like I said before, if you just base it on the 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 rank structure of the marshalate, he's second to Berthier um, in the first creation. Um, he is an intrinsic part of the empire. And he's a very Napoleon type figure, just without the sort of the keen instinct for higher level command, because he actively tries, just like to pull a Bernadotte, basically, to maintain his throne, to maintain what he has got out of nothing. He is weirdly, ostrich feathers and all, tiger draped horses and, shadow tight uniforms, the lot. He is at first a show soldier who nevertheless becomes one of the most prominent soldiers of Europe, renowned across the European countries, celebrated even by his enemies. And at the end, he gets out of his depth as a statesman in the mire of post-Napoleonic politics. But that's the difference between Murat and Ney. They're working on different levels, coming from a similar place.
I was just going to ask, how much do you feel of Murat's legacy does he ultimately taint by essentially throwing his own life away in the end? Because
Exactly.
I think it's telling that Napoleon, who in some cases could be like ludicrously forgiven of personal betrayals, refuses to see him. In 1815, he welcomes quite a lot of people back into the fold, people who aren't necessarily on close terms with him, people like Brune. And when Murat turns up, he refuses to see him. And I think if Murat could have been contented with comparable obscurity and had gone into Austria like his wife, it wouldn't have been a grand ending. He could have potentially lived with his wife, with his children, and continued, but he wanted his throne. And it feels like, one of the things we said when we started doing the Marshal episodes was if you play the Napoleonic Game of Thrones, you win, you die. Murat played it and he didn't win. And it just feels like such a waste of and it equals out in Murat style, undoubtedly, but it feels like such a waste of a life when he could have been contented with a bit less and survived.
It's a great point, Rachel. I'd almost counter, though, that I think as soon as he made the deal with the Allies in 1814, he regretted it. I think Caroline had a big part in that. And I think he somewhat saved his reputation. He didn't want to go out like Marmont, no offense, as a traitor to Napoleon. And I think that's why he corresponded with Napoleon on Elba, and that's why he attacked the Austrians in 1815. He didn't want to go out, even if it cost him his life, as a traitor to France. And I think that's why he'd do what he did.
Well, that's part of this whole discussion about greatest marshal, what the legacy and everything. That is essentially what undid Bernadotte, essentially because he was one of the top military figures in France, who, when he was given a constitutional role elsewhere, did the principal thing, gave it up, and became king of Sweden. Murat seems to be kind of trying to do the same thing in Naples with slightly more self-interest because he knows the Allies don't want him there. And so it's in his best interest in 1815 to try and reforge that alliance with Napoleon. This comes under the whole loyalty kind of discussion, realistically speaking. And I'm not sure if it really pertains greatly to Murat because I think that he did what Napoleon would have done in the similar situation to try and hold on to the throne. But that is always going to be a problem. In a way, the biggest problem with Murat is that period of 1812 to 1815. And that is it. But before that point, and frankly, for my money, you can't kick Murat out of the balloon in this round simply because of how integral he was to every battle, practically, all the big ones, and the rise of Napoleon and the empire itself up until 1812.
See, I agree, but for the reason that I've already stated, that actually it's you need these Murats in history to get people to study this history and therefore find out more about it. So I'm with you that Murat has to stay.
Yeah, we're winning you over to seeing Murat as a human being, Zach, aren't we? Come on.
I've always seen him as a human being, just a deeply flawed human being who I do not like on a personal level. Like, I can respect plenty about him. Would I go drinking with him? No, but then admittedly,
I would not advise that because he could drink everybody under the table.
That's exactly what I was about to say. Yes. So I think Murat survives. I think Marmont survives because of what I say, which means, with regards to Marmont, in terms of having that smart. Oh, Noah's already saluting. Noah's read this script already and seen where it's gone.
I cannot kick Marmont if I couldn't keep Ney, because I was going to kick Saint-Cyr for Ney.
I don't follow your logic there.
If I would have saved Ney if I could have, I would have saved Ney. I voted.
You're voting for Marmont?
No, but if you then place Saint-Cyr next to Marmont, then you get rid of Saint-Cyr.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I'm with you.
Even I'd get rid of Saint-Cyr.
I mean, no, you kind of set us up for a fool here when you said, so Saint-Cyr doesn't really have a legacy. Which, like, I respect.
Was I wrong? Was I wrong?
I mean, on the basis that Murat has to stay and Marmont has to stay, we're left with a choice between Davout and Saint-Cyr. And Noah, like, I love you dearly. You've been a valiant defender of Saint-Cyr who's survived far longer than I expected. Catherine, do you have any arguments against our purge of Saint-Cyr?
I think it's tribute to how charismatic and brilliant a defense Noah put up that we're even having this discussion. So well done.
Because I would have kicked you out last round.
Josh, can you stop being mean to my guests, please?
It deserved, I'd say. Again, I was surprised as anyone to be not in that first round. But if I'd lost to ChatGPT, I probably would have thrown myself off this window. But thank you all for calling it a credible attempt. I shall take it as highest praise.
Very
And
well
so Saint-Cyr is eliminated, which leaves us with our final three from this semi-final. Davout, Murat, and Marmont go ahead to the public vote. Let's be honest, Marmont's not going to survive the public vote. People hate Marmont far too. I'm sorry, Dave. Like, I would love to see you in the final, but realistically, I don't think that's going to happen. Folks, you can get involved. Now it is over to you. The power is in your hands. Democracy manifest, because you will decide which one survives the public vote and takes the place in the grand final. So check out below. Either you'll be able to comment on social media, or if you're listening on Spotify, you can vote in the poll that we'll run. So if you can't do that because you're not on Spotify, head over to either Facebook, Twitter, or Blue Sky and comment on who is your winner for this semi. I want to end by saying a massive thank you to my brilliant guests over the course of all of these heats, but particularly tonight. You've heard Rachel Stark, Dave Watson, John Viscardo, Noah Fink, and Todd Campbell. Worthy, worthy competitors. You have done your chosen marshals proud. We doff our assorted hats to you, whether they are fedoras, bicorns, bearskins, or anything else, quite frankly. Nobody's broken out a bonnet. Oh no, I stand corrected. Todd has now broken out a bonnet. Well played. But also a massive thank you to my brilliant judges on this one, Josh Proven and Catherine Bayford. Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Both we and the Battle of the Marshals will be back very soon. Did you enjoy this episode? Be sure to subscribe so that you can find your way back to us. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late June 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, John Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willett, Wojciech Stefanovic, Simon Weathers, Zach Johnson, Robin Painter, and Simon Weathers. The Admirals, Ian Harding, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and Darla Vincent. The Chiefs of Staff, David Maxwell and Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Dan Hazelwood and Rob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.